Lovers, before we dive into one of the most chilling tales from 1841 Alabama, make sure to hit that subscribe button because you're about to hear a story that will keep you awake at night. Share this video with someone brave enough to handle the truth and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love connecting with viewers from around the world. Now let's step back in time to a place where justice wore a different face and secrets buried in the red clay soil of Alabama were about to surface in the most terrifying way imaginable. The morning mist clung to the Tallapoosa River like a shroud, and it was there, among the twisted roots of ancient cypress trees, that Elias Crowder first laid eyes on her. The year was 1841, and the Cherokee removal was still a fresh wound across the American South. Most of the indigenous people had been forced westward on what would later be called the Trail of Tears, but some had managed to hide, to survive in the shadows of their ancestral lands. Owani lay unconscious on the riverbank, her dark hair matted with blood from a gash across her forehead. Her traditional Cherokee dress was torn and muddy, and her breathing was shallow but steady. She couldn't have been more than 20 years old, with high cheekbones and skin the color of burnished copper. Even in her unconscious state, there was something about her that made Crowder pause, a dignity that seemed to radiate from her very being. Elias Crowder was not known for his compassion. At 45, he was a man carved from the harsh realities of frontier life. His plantation, Crowder's Rest, sprawled across 300 acres of prime Alabama farmland, worked by a dozen enslaved people who knew better than to meet his eyes directly. His wife had died in childbirth 5 years earlier, leaving him with 2 sons, Marcus, 17, and already showing his father's cruel streak, and little Thomas, barely 8 years old and still innocent enough to flinch at his father's raised voice. Standing over Owani's still form, Crowder's mind raced with possibilities. The Cherokee were considered enemies of the state, and harboring one could bring unwanted attention from federal authorities. But she was also a potential asset, another pair of hands to work his land, and one that would cost him nothing. The fact that she was beautiful didn't escape his notice either, though he pushed such thoughts aside for the moment. "Marcus!" he called to his older son, who was fishing further downstream. "Come help me with this." Marcus jogged over, his boots squelching in the muddy bank. When he saw Owani, his eyes widened. "Is she dead, Pa?" "No, but she's hurt bad." "Help me get her to the wagon." They carried her between them, her body limp and surprisingly light. As they lifted her into the back of Crowder's wooden cart, Owani's eyes fluttered open for just a moment. They were the deepest brown Marcus had ever seen, almost black, and they seemed to look right through him. Then they closed again, and she was still. The ride back to Crowder's Rest took 20 minutes through dense pine forest and red dirt roads. The plantation house was a modest 2-story structure with white columns that had seen better days. Behind it stood the slave quarters, a row of small wooden cabins that housed Crowder's workforce. It was to one of these cabins that he directed his sons to carry the unconscious Cherokee woman. "Put her in the empty cabin at the end," Crowder instructed, "and Marcus, not a word of this to anyone. You understand?" Marcus nodded, though something in his father's tone made him uneasy. He'd seen that look in Crowder's eyes before, the same calculating expression he wore when examining livestock at market. They laid Owani on a rough straw mattress in the small cabin. The space was barely 8 feet square, with a single window and a dirt floor. It had been empty since the previous occupant, an elderly man named Samuel, had died of fever the winter before. Crowder sent Marcus to fetch water and clean rags while he examined their unexpected guest more closely. The gash on her head was deep but not life-threatening. More concerning were the bruises on her arms and the way her ribs showed through her torn dress. She'd been running for days, possibly weeks, with little food or rest. Her feet were cut and swollen, wrapped in makeshift bandages made from strips of her own clothing. When Marcus returned with the supplies, they cleaned her wounds in silence. Awani stirred several times but didn't fully wake. Once, she murmured something in Cherokee that neither of them understood, her voice carrying a musical quality that seemed at odds with their rough surroundings. "What do you think happened to her?" Marcus asked as they worked. Crowder shrugged. "Probably got separated from one of the removal groups, maybe tried to come back to find family." He didn't mention his suspicion that she might have been running from something or someone else entirely. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Awani finally opened her eyes fully. She looked around the cabin with obvious confusion before her gaze settled on Crowder's face. There was no fear there, which surprised him. Instead, she studied him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You speak English?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "Some." Her voice was hoarse but clear. "What's your name?" "Awani." She struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her injuries. "Well, Awani, you're on my land now, my property. You understand what that means?" Something flickered in her dark eyes. Not fear, but a kind of sad recognition. She'd heard these words before, or words like them. "I understand." "Good. You'll work for your keep. Help in the house, tend the garden, whatever needs doing. You cause any trouble, and I'll turn you over to the authorities. They're still hunting Cherokee stragglers, and I doubt they'd be gentle about it." Awani said nothing, but her gaze never left his face. There was something unsettling about the way she looked at him, as if she could see past his words to something deeper and darker beneath. That night, as Crowder lay in his bed listening to the sounds of the Alabama wilderness, he couldn't shake the feeling that bringing Awani to his plantation had been a mistake. But it was too late now. She was here, and she was his responsibility, his property, as he'd made clear. What he didn't know was that Awani lay awake in her small cabin, staring at the ceiling and remembering the old stories her grandmother had told her. Stories about what happened when the balance of the world was disturbed, when cruelty and injustice reached a point where the spirits themselves demanded retribution. Outside, an owl called from the darkness, its voice carrying across the plantation like a warning that no one was listening to. Yet, the rooster's crow pierced the pre-dawn darkness, and Awani was already awake. She had spent the night listening to the sounds of Crowder's rest, the creaking of old wood, the distant lowing of cattle, and the whispered conversations from the other slave cabins. Her body ached from her injuries, but her mind was clear and focused. She understood exactly where she was and what was expected of her. Elias Crowder appeared at her cabin door just as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the pine trees. He carried a bundle of clothes, a simple grey dress, worn but clean, and a pair of leather shoes that had seen better days. "Put these on," he said, tossing the bundle onto her mattress. "Then come to the main house. Time you started earning your keep." Awani nodded without speaking. She had learned long ago that silence was often the wisest response to men like Crowder. As he turned to leave, she spoke quietly. "The clothes belonged to your wife." Crowder froze in the doorway. He turned back slowly, his eyes narrowing. "How could you possibly know that? The scent of lavender water, the careful mending at the seams, a woman who took pride in her appearance, even in simple things." Awani's voice was matter-of-fact, but there was something in her tone that made Crowder's skin crawl. "My wife's been dead 5 years, he said harshly. "I know." Awani met his gaze steadily. "The sadness in this place, it has layers. Old grief, fresh anger, and something else, something that watches and waits." Crowder felt a chill run down his spine, but he forced himself to scoff. "Cherokee superstition, I don't have time for such nonsense. Be at the house in 10 minutes or you'll go without breakfast." After he left, Awani changed into the dead woman's clothes. They fit her perfectly, which didn't surprise her. She had always been sensitive to the echoes that lingered in places and objects. The dress carried memories, happiness, love, and then terrible pain. Margaret Crowder had been a good woman trapped in a hard life, and her death had left a wound in this place that had never properly healed. The main house was larger than it had appeared from a distance. The kitchen was spacious, with a large hearth and well-worn wooden counters. Awani found Crowder there, with his younger son Thomas, who was picking at a plate of eggs and biscuits. The boy looked up when she entered, his blue eyes wide with curiosity. "This is Awani," Crowder said without looking up from his coffee. "She'll be helping around the house. Thomas, you mind your manners around her, you hear?" Thomas nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir. Are you really an Indian?" he asked Awani. "Cherokee," she corrected gently. "And yes, I am." "Did you live in a teepee?" Awani smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth she'd shown since arriving. "No, little one. My people lived in houses, much like this one. We farmed the land and raised families just as you do." Crowder slammed his coffee cup down on the table. "Enough chatter. Awani, you'll start by cleaning the upstairs rooms. Thomas, get yourself ready for your lessons with Reverend Morrison." As Thomas scampered upstairs, Crowder turned to Awani with a warning look. "Don't fill the boy's head with stories. He's got enough imagination as it is." "What kind of stories concern you, Mr. Crowder?" "Any stories. The past is dead and buried, and that's where it should stay." But Awani could see that the past was very much alive in this house. As she climbed the stairs to begin her work, she felt the weight of accumulated sorrow pressing down on her. The walls themselves seemed to whisper of loss and loneliness. The master bedroom was at the front of the house, overlooking the long drive lined with oak trees. It was clear that no woman had lived here for years. Dust covered every surface, and the air was stale and lifeless. But as Awani began to clean, she could sense the echoes of happier times. Margaret Crowder had loved this room, had filled it with small touches that made it a home rather than just a house. In the bottom drawer of the dresser, Awani found a small wooden box. Inside were letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, love letters from Elias to Margaret during their courtship. The handwriting was careful and tender, so different from the harsh man she'd met that it was hard to believe they came from the same person. "My dearest Margaret," one letter began, "your kindness is like sunlight after a long winter. You make me want to be a better man than I am." Awani carefully replaced the letters and closed the box. She was beginning to understand the source of the darkness that permeated this place. Elias Crowder had once been capable of love, but grief had twisted that capacity into something bitter and cruel. His wife's death had broken something fundamental in him, and everyone around him suffered for it. The sound of horses approaching drew her to the window. A group of men on horseback was riding up the drive. 5 of them, led by a man in a black coat and hat. Even from a distance, Awani could sense their purpose. They were hunters, and they were looking for someone. She heard Crowder's voice from the front porch, greeting the visitors with forced joviality. "Sheriff Patterson, what brings you out this way?" "Morning, Elias. We're tracking a Cherokee woman who escaped from a removal group near Huntsville. Young woman, about 20, dark hair. You seen anyone like that around here?" Awani's blood ran cold. She pressed herself against the wall beside the window, listening intently. "Cherokee? No, can't say I have. Most of them are long gone from these parts." "This one's different. The soldiers say she killed a guard during the escape, stabbed him with a broken piece of pottery. We've been tracking her for 2 weeks." There was a long pause before Crowder responded. "Well, if I see anything, I'll be sure to let you know, Sheriff." "Appreciate it. Mind if we take a look around? Check your slave quarters?" "Course not. Marcus, show the sheriff and his men around the property." Awani heard footsteps on the stairs and quickly resumed her cleaning. Her mind raced as she tried to process what she'd just heard. Someone was looking for her, and they believed she was a murderer. But she had no memory of killing anyone. Her last clear recollection was of running through the forest, pursued by voices and the sound of dogs. The bedroom door opened, and Crowder stepped inside. His expression was unreadable as he studied her face. "Seems you're more valuable than I thought," he said quietly. "A wanted woman. That changes things considerably." Awani straightened, meeting his gaze. "I don't remember killing anyone." "Doesn't matter what you remember. What matters is what they believe." He moved closer, and she could smell whiskey on his breath despite the early hour. "Here's how this is going to work. You'll do exactly as I say when I say it. No questions, no hesitation. In return, I'll keep your secret. But if you ever cross me, if you ever give me reason to regret this decision, I'll turn you over to Sheriff Patterson myself." "Understood." Awani nodded, though something cold and hard was forming in her chest. She had escaped one form of captivity only to find herself in another, perhaps worse than the first. "Good. Now finish up here and start on the other rooms. And Awani?" He paused at the door. "Welcome to Crowder's Rest. I have a feeling you're going to be with us for a very long time." As his footsteps faded down the hallway, Awani sank onto the edge of the bed. Through the window, she could see the sheriff and his men searching the slave quarters, their movements methodical and thorough. They would find nothing, of course, but their presence was a reminder of how precarious her situation had become. She closed her eyes and tried to remember her grandmother's teachings about patience and endurance. But beneath those lessons, older and darker knowledge stirred. Knowledge about justice and retribution, about the price that must eventually be paid for cruelty and oppression. The spirits of her ancestors had not abandoned her. They were simply waiting for the right moment to act. 3 weeks had passed since Sheriff Patterson's visit, and Awani had settled into the rhythm of life at Crowder's Rest. She worked from dawn until dusk, cleaning the house, tending the garden, and helping with meals. To the outside world, she appeared to be just another servant, quiet and obedient. But those who looked closely might have noticed that the other enslaved people on the plantation had begun to treat her with a mixture of respect and wariness that went beyond mere curiosity about her Cherokee heritage. It started with small things. Old Moses, who tended the horses, claimed that the animals were calmer when Awani was near. Sarah, the cook, swore that vegetables grew faster in the sections of garden where Awani worked. And little Thomas Crowder had begun following her around like a lost puppy, drawn by her gentle manner and the stories she told him when his father wasn't listening. But it was the dreams that truly marked the beginning of something darker. Elias Crowder had always been a heavy sleeper, but lately his nights were plagued by vivid, disturbing visions. He would find himself walking through a forest that seemed familiar yet wrong, where the trees whispered in a language he couldn't understand, and shadows moved independently of their sources. In these dreams, he was always being watched, followed by eyes that glowed like embers in the darkness. He would wake gasping, his nightshirt soaked with sweat, and lie staring at the ceiling until dawn. During the day, he found himself increasingly irritable and suspicious. He snapped at his sons, berated the field hands for imaginary infractions, and drank more heavily than usual. The only person who seemed immune to his growing volatility was Awani herself, who continued her work with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown from the beginning. It was Marcus who first noticed that something was genuinely wrong. The 17-year-old had inherited his father's cruel streak, but he was also more observant than Elias gave him credit for. He began to notice patterns that others missed: the way birds fell silent when Awani walked beneath the trees, how dogs whimpered and hid when she passed, and most disturbing of all, the way his father's behavior changed whenever she was nearby. On a humid Thursday evening in late September, Marcus decided to follow Awani after her work was done. He watched from his bedroom window as she left the main house and walked toward the slave quarters. But instead of going to her own cabin, she continued past them into the woods that bordered the plantation. Marcus waited 10 minutes before following, moving as quietly as he could through the underbrush. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to see by, but the forest seemed darker than usual, as if the shadows were thicker and more substantial. He could hear Awani moving ahead of him, but when he tried to get closer, she always seemed to be just out of sight. After 20 minutes of careful stalking, Marcus found himself in a small clearing he'd never seen before, despite having explored these woods since childhood. Ancient oak trees formed a rough circle around a space where the grass grew in strange patterns, and in the center stood Awani. She was no longer wearing the simple grey dress she'd worked in all day. Instead, she was clothed in traditional Cherokee garments, a white deerskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork that seemed to glow in the moonlight. Her long black hair hung loose around her shoulders, and she was speaking in Cherokee, her voice rising and falling in what sounded like a chant or prayer. Marcus crept closer, hiding behind a massive oak trunk. As his eyes adjusted to the strange light in the clearing, he realized that Awani was not alone. Translucent figures moved around the edges of the space, men and women in traditional Cherokee dress, their faces painted for war or ceremony. They seemed to be listening to Awani's words, nodding in agreement or making gestures of encouragement. The temperature in the clearing dropped suddenly, and Marcus's breath began to mist in the air. He pressed himself against the oak tree, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure Awani would hear it. But she continued her chant, seemingly unaware of his presence. Then one of the ghostly figures turned and looked directly at him. Marcus bit back a scream as the spirit, for what else could it be, approached his hiding place. It was an elderly Cherokee man with silver hair braided with feathers and a face marked by deep lines of wisdom and sorrow. When he spoke, his voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You should not be here, young wolf. This is not your time or place." I was just..." Marcus stammered, but the spirit held up a hand for silence. "Your father has taken something that does not belong to him. A daughter of the Cherokee, a keeper of old knowledge. The spirits grow restless and the debt must be paid." "What debt? What are you talking about?" The spirit's eyes, black as midnight, seemed to look right through him. "Blood calls to blood, young wolf. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Tell your father that the ancestors are watching and they are not pleased." Before Marcus could respond, the spirit faded away like morning mist. The other figures around the clearing began to disappear as well, until only Awani remained. She had stopped chanting and was looking directly at Marcus's hiding place. "You can come out now," she said quietly. "They're gone." Marcus emerged from behind the tree on shaking legs. What? What were those things? My ancestors, the spirits of those who came before. Awani's voice was calm, but there was something different about her now, a power that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had been carefully hidden. They're concerned about the balance of things, about justice. Justice for what? Awani studied his face in the moonlight. Despite his father's influence, she could see that Marcus was not yet completely lost to cruelty. There was still a chance for him, if he chose to take it. "Your father believes he owns me," she said finally. "But no one can own another person's spirit, and when that spirit belongs to someone with particular gifts, the consequences can be severe." "What kind of gifts?" Instead of answering directly, Awani gestured toward a dead tree at the edge of the clearing. As Marcus watched in amazement, new leaves began to sprout from its branches, growing and unfurling until the tree was green and healthy once more. "My grandmother was a medicine woman," Awani explained. "She taught me the old ways, the connections between all living things, but she also taught me about balance, how the world corrects itself when that balance is disturbed." Marcus stared at the restored tree, his mind struggling to process what he'd witnessed. "Are you going to hurt my father?" "I don't need to hurt him. He's hurting himself, little by little. Every day he chooses cruelty over kindness. The spirits are simply encouraging that process." As if to emphasize her point, a wolf howled in the distance, a sound that shouldn't have been possible since wolves had been hunted to extinction in this part of Alabama decades ago. The howl was answered by another, then another, until the night was filled with their voices. "You should go back to the house," Awani said gently. "And Marcus, it would be better if you didn't tell your father about this conversation. Some knowledge is dangerous in the wrong hands." Marcus nodded numbly and stumbled back through the forest toward home. Behind him, he could hear Awani beginning to chant again, her voice blending with the wolf songs until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. When he reached his bedroom, Marcus found his father standing at the window, staring out at the woods with a haunted expression. "Did you hear them?" Elias asked without turning around. "Hear what, Pa?" "The wolves. They've been calling for the past hour." Crowder's voice was hoarse, as if he'd been shouting. "But there ain't supposed to be any wolves left in these parts." Marcus joined his father at the window. The forest was dark and silent now, but he could still feel the weight of watching eyes among the trees. "Maybe they came down from Tennessee," he suggested weakly. Crowder shook his head. "No, this is something else. Something wrong." He turned to look at his son, and Marcus was shocked by how much his father had aged in just a few weeks. There were new lines around his eyes, and his hair seemed grayer than before. "Pa, are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine," Crowder snapped, but his hands were shaking as he reached for the whiskey bottle on his nightstand. "Just tired. It's been a long day." As Marcus left his father's room, he couldn't shake the feeling that things at Crowder's Rest were about to change dramatically. The spirits Awani had summoned were patient, but they were also implacable. Justice might be delayed, but it would not be denied. And somewhere in the darkness, the wolves continued to sing their ancient songs of retribution. October brought an unseasonable chill to Alabama, and with it, a series of events that would shake Crowder's Rest to its very foundations. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came on a gray Tuesday morning when old Moses found 3 of Crowder's prize cattle dead in the pasture. They lay in a perfect triangle, their bodies unmarked, but their eyes wide open, staring sightlessly at the sky. "Ain't nothing natural about this," Moses muttered as he led Crowder to examine the scene. "No wounds, no signs of sickness, they just died." Elias Crowder knelt beside the nearest carcass, running his hands over the animal's hide. The cow had been healthy the day before, grazing peacefully with the rest of the herd. Now it was cold and stiff, its body already beginning to attract flies despite the cool weather. "Could be poison," Crowder said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Maybe someone's trying to sabotage my operation." But even as he spoke, his eyes were drawn to something that made his blood run cold. Carved into the earth around each dead animal were symbols he didn't recognize, intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when he looked at them directly. They appeared to be Cherokee in origin, though their meaning was lost on him. "Boss," Moses said quietly, "maybe we should call the sheriff." "No." Crowder's response was sharp and immediate. The last thing he needed was Sheriff Patterson poking around his property again, especially with Awani still hidden among his household staff. "We'll bury them ourselves. And Moses, not a word of this to anyone, you understand?" Moses nodded reluctantly, but Crowder could see the fear in the old man's eyes. Word would spread anyway. It always did on a plantation. By evening, every person on Crowder's Rest would know about the dead cattle and the strange symbols, and they would draw their own conclusions about what it meant. That night, Crowder found himself unable to sleep. He paced his bedroom, drinking whiskey and staring out at the dark forest beyond his property. The wolves had been howling again, their voices seeming to come from all directions at once. Sometimes he thought he could hear other sounds mixed in with their calls, human voices speaking in Cherokee, chanting words that made his skin crawl. Around midnight, he heard footsteps in the hallway outside his room. soft, careful steps that paused outside his door before continuing toward the stairs. Crowder grabbed his rifle and eased the door open, peering into the darkened corridor. A figure in white was descending the staircase, Awani, moving like a ghost through his house. She wore the same traditional Cherokee dress Marcus had described from his encounter in the forest, and her long hair flowed behind her like a dark river. In her hands, she carried something that glowed with a faint, otherworldly light. Crowder followed at a distance, his bare feet silent on the wooden floors. Awani moved through the house as if she owned it, pausing occasionally to touch a wall or doorframe. Wherever her fingers made contact, the wood seemed to shimmer and change, taking on patterns that hurt to look at directly. She made her way to the kitchen, where she began to work with whatever she was carrying. As Crowder crept closer, he could see that it was some kind of clay vessel, decorated with the same symbols he'd seen around the dead cattle. Awani was mixing something inside it, herbs perhaps, or powders that gave off a sweet, cloying scent. "You can come out, Mr. Crowder," she said without turning around. "I know you're there." Crowder stepped into the kitchen, his rifle trained on her back. "What are you doing in my house?" "Preparing." Awani continued her work, grinding something with a stone pestle. "The spirits are growing impatient. They've waited long enough for justice to be served." "Justice? What justice? I saved your life! I gave you shelter when you had nowhere else to go!" Now Awani did turn, and Crowder took an involuntary step backward. Her eyes were no longer the warm brown he remembered, but black as midnight, reflecting the lamplight like polished obsidian. When she smiled, her teeth seemed sharper than they should have been. "You made me a slave, Mr. Crowder. You threatened to turn me over to men who would see me hanged for a crime I didn't commit. You've used my fear and desperation to control me, just as you control everyone else on this plantation." Her voice was calm, conversational, but there was something underneath it that made Crowder's hands shake. "I could have left you to die by that river." "Yes, you could have. And perhaps that would have been kinder." Awani returned to her work, adding a pinch of something dark to her mixture. "But you didn't. You saw an opportunity to add to your collection of human property, and you took it. Now the debt must be paid." "What debt? I don't owe you anything." "Not me, Mr. Crowder. Them." Awani gestured toward the window, and Crowder's blood froze as he saw faces pressed against the glass. Cherokee faces painted for war, their eyes burning with an inner fire. "My people, your people, all the souls who have suffered under systems like the one you perpetuate." And the faces at the window began to multiply, filling every pane of glass in the kitchen. Men, women, children, all bearing the marks of violence and injustice. Some wore traditional Cherokee dress, while others were clothed in the simple garments of enslaved people. They were all watching Crowder with expressions of patient, implacable judgment. "This isn't real," Crowder whispered, backing toward the door. "You're some kind of witch. This is all tricks and illusions." "Is it?" Awani held up the clay vessel, which now glowed with an inner light that cast dancing shadows on the walls. "Tell me, Mr. Crowder, how have you been sleeping lately? How are your dreams?" Crowder's rifle wavered in his hands. The truth was, he hadn't had a peaceful night's sleep since bringing Awani to his plantation. His dreams were filled with images of burning forests and screaming voices, of endless trails lined with the bodies of the dead and dying. He would wake each morning feeling as if he hadn't slept at all, his body aching and his mind clouded with guilt he couldn't explain. "You're doing something to me," he accused, "poisoning me somehow. I'm not doing anything to you that you haven't already done to yourself." Awani set the vessel on the kitchen table, where it continued to pulse with that eerie light. "Guilt is a powerful force, Mr. Crowder. It eats away at a man from the inside, especially when that man has spent years convincing himself that his cruelty is justified. I'm not cruel. I provide for my people. Your people. Awani's laugh was like the sound of wind through dead leaves. You mean your property? The human beings you've convinced yourself are somehow less than human, so you can sleep at night despite owning their bodies and souls. The faces at the windows were pressing closer now, their breath fogging the glass. Crowder could hear them whispering, their voices blending into a chorus of accusation and demand for justice. The temperature in the kitchen was dropping rapidly, and frost was beginning to form on the surfaces around Awani. "What do you want from me?" Crowder's voice cracked with desperation. "I want you to understand," Awani said simply. "I want you to feel what it's like to be powerless, to be at the mercy of someone who sees you as less than human. I want you to experience the fear and desperation of knowing that your life means nothing to the person who controls it." As she spoke, the clay vessel on the table began to crack, releasing wisps of smoke that smelled of burning sage and something else, something organic and unpleasant. The smoke swirled around Crowder, and suddenly he was no longer standing in his kitchen. He was running through a forest, his feet bare and bleeding, his clothes torn by thorns and branches. Behind him, he could hear the baying of hounds and the shouts of men on horseback. His lungs burned with each breath, and his legs felt like lead, but he couldn't stop running because he knew what would happen if they caught him. The vision lasted only seconds, but when it ended, Crowder found himself on his knees in the kitchen, gasping for air. Awani stood over him, her expression almost pitying. "That was just a taste," she said softly. "A small sample of what my people endured during the removal. What they're still enduring, those who survived. What your enslaved workers endure every day under your rule." Crowder struggled to his feet, his rifle forgotten on the floor. "Please," he whispered. "I'll let you go. I'll give you money, supplies, whatever you need. Just leave my family alone." "Your family?" Awani tilted her head, considering. "Thomas is a good boy. He has his mother's kindness, despite your influence. He might still be saved, but Marcus..." She shook her head sadly. "Marcus has already chosen his path. He enjoys the power that comes with cruelty, just as you do. They're just children. So were the Cherokee children who died on the Trail of Tears. So are the enslaved children who grow up knowing they'll never be free." Awani picked up the cracked vessel, cradling it gently in her hands. "The spirits don't distinguish between the guilty and the innocent, Mr. Crowder. They only see the debt that must be paid." The faces at the windows were fading now, but their whispers continued to fill the air. Crowder could make out individual words in Cherokee and English, fragments of prayers and curses that seemed to seep into his very bones. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Until the debt is paid in full." Awani moved toward the door, her white dress rustling like autumn leaves. "Until justice is served and the balance is restored." As she reached the threshold, she paused and looked back at him one final time. "You still have choices, Mr. Crowder. You can continue down the path you've chosen and face whatever consequences the spirits deem appropriate. Or you can try to make amends for the harm you've caused. The decision is yours." Then she was gone, leaving Crowder alone in the kitchen with the lingering scent of sage and the echo of Cherokee voices in the air. He sank into a chair, his hands shaking as he reached for the whiskey bottle he'd left on the counter. Outside, the wolves began to howl again, their voices rising and falling in harmonies that sounded almost like laughter. And in the distance, barely audible above the wind, Crowder could swear he heard the sound of drums beating out an ancient rhythm of judgment and retribution. The unraveling had begun, and there would be no stopping it now. The morning after Crowder's encounter with Awani in the kitchen, the plantation woke to find that everything had changed. The enslaved workers emerged from their quarters to discover that the locks on their cabin doors had been broken from the inside. though no one remembered hearing any noise during the night. The field tools had been arranged in perfect circles around the work areas, and every whip on the property had been found hanging from tree branches, their leather strips braided together in patterns that hurt to look at directly. But it was the discovery in Crowder's study that truly marked the beginning of the end. Marcus found his father there at dawn, slumped over his desk with his head in his hands. The room reeked of whiskey and something else, a sweet, cloying odor that reminded Marcus of flowers left too long in a vase. Every book on the shelves had been opened to the same page, though the text on those pages was no longer in English. Instead, Cherokee symbols covered the paper, seeming to move and shift when viewed directly. "Pa?" Marcus approached cautiously. "Pa, are you all right?" Elias Crowder looked up, and Marcus gasped at what he saw. His father's hair had gone completely white overnight, and his eyes were bloodshot and wild. Deep lines had appeared on his face, aging him by decades in a single evening. "She's in the walls," Crowder whispered hoarsely. "I can hear her moving through the house, but when I go to look, there's nothing there, just whispers, always whispering." Marcus glanced around the study, noting the strange symbols and the unnatural arrangement of objects. "Pa, I think we need to get you to a doctor." "You're not well." "Not well?" Crowder laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Boy, I'm cursed. That Cherokee witch has called down something dark on this house, and it's not going to stop until—" He trailed off, staring at something Marcus couldn't see. "Until what?" "Until justice is served." The voice came from behind them, and both men spun around to find Awani standing in the doorway. She wore her simple grey work dress, but there was nothing simple about the power that radiated from her presence. The air around her seemed to shimmer with heat, and the Cherokee symbols on the book pages glowed brighter in response to her proximity. "Get out of my house!" Crowder snarled, reaching for the pistol in his desk drawer. But when his fingers closed around the weapon, it crumbled to dust in his hands. "This was never your house, Mr. Crowder. This land belonged to my people long before your ancestors arrived. You're nothing more than a temporary occupant, and your lease has expired." Marcus backed toward the window, his heart pounding. "What do you want from us?" Awani's gaze shifted to him, and for a moment her expression softened. "From you? Nothing, if you choose wisely. You're young enough to change, to become something better than what your father has tried to make you. But the choice must be yours." "And from me?" Crowder demanded, struggling to his feet. "What do you want from me? I want you to understand what you've taken. Not just from me, but from everyone you've claimed to own." Awani stepped into the room, and the temperature dropped noticeably. "I want you to feel the weight of every life you've destroyed, every dream you've crushed, every family you've torn apart." As she spoke, the walls of the study began to change. The wood grain shifted and flowed like water, forming images that told the story of the plantation's dark history. Marcus watched in horrified fascination as scenes played out before his eyes. Enslaved families being separated at auction, workers being beaten for minor infractions, children born into bondage with no hope of freedom. But it wasn't just the enslaved people whose suffering was depicted. The walls also showed Cherokee families being driven from their homes, forced to march westward on a trail that would claim thousands of lives. Marcus saw Awani as a child, watching her village burn while soldiers herded her people like cattle. "Stop it," Crowder whispered, pressing his hands to his eyes. "Make it stop." "I can't stop the truth, Mr. Crowder. I can only make sure you finally see it clearly." The images on the walls were becoming more vivid, more real. Marcus could smell the smoke from burning Cherokee homes, could hear the cries of children separated from their parents. The weight of accumulated suffering pressed down on him like a physical force, making it hard to breathe. "This isn't my fault," Crowder protested weakly. "I didn't create this system. I was born into it just like everyone else." But you chose to perpetuate it, Awani replied. You chose cruelty over kindness, profit over humanity. And now the spirits of those you've wronged have come to collect what's owed. The door to the study slammed shut, though no wind had blown through the house. The windows darkened as if storm clouds had suddenly gathered outside, but when Marcus looked through the glass, he saw not clouds but faces, hundreds of them, all watching the scene unfold with expressions of grim satisfaction. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Now your father pays the price for his choices." Awani raised her hand, and the Cherokee symbols on the book pages began to glow brighter. The spirits have been patient, but their patience has limits. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Crowder suddenly doubled over, clutching his chest. I can't breathe," he gasped. "Something's crushing me." "That's the weight of guilt, Mr. Crowder. The accumulated burden of every cruel act, every moment of callous indifference. You've carried it for so long that you'd forgotten it was there, but now it's time to feel its full weight." Marcus watched in horror as his father collapsed to his knees, his face contorting with pain. But it wasn't physical pain. It was something deeper, more fundamental. It was the agony of a soul, finally confronting the full extent of its own corruption. "Please," Marcus begged Awani. "He's still my father. Whatever he's done, he doesn't deserve this." Awani turned to look at him, and Marcus was surprised to see tears in her dark eyes. "Doesn't he? What about the fathers who were sold away from their children? What about the Cherokee fathers who died on the trail, never to see their families again? Did they deserve their fate?" Marcus had no answer for that. He could only watch as his father writhed on the floor, fighting against invisible bonds that seemed to be crushing the life out of him. "There is one way," Awani said quietly. "One chance for redemption if he's willing to take it." "What?" Marcus grabbed her arm desperately. "What can he do?" "He can free them, all of them. Every person he claims to own, he can set free. He can sign over his land to those who work it, give them the means to build new lives. He can try to undo some of the harm he's caused." Crowder looked up from the floor, his eyes wild with pain and desperation. The papers," he wheezed. "In the safe. Deeds, bills of sale." "I'll sign whatever you want." Awani nodded to Marcus. "Get them, all of them." Marcus rushed to the safe behind his father's desk, his hands shaking as he worked the combination. Inside were dozens of documents. Legal papers that represented the ownership of human beings, deeds to land that had been stolen from its original inhabitants, contracts that bound people to lives of servitude. "Bring them here," Awani instructed. As Marcus spread the papers on the desk, Awani began to speak in Cherokee, her voice rising and falling in what sounded like a formal incantation. The symbols on the book pages pulsed in rhythm with her words, and the faces at the windows pressed closer as if straining to hear. "Sign them," she told Crowder, "all of them. Transfer ownership of the land to those who work it. Free every person you've claimed to own. Do it now, while there's still time." Crowder struggled to his feet, his hands shaking as he reached for a pen. One by one, he signed the documents, each signature seeming to cost him tremendous effort. With every name he wrote, the crushing weight on his chest seemed to lessen slightly. But Marcus could see that the process was taking a terrible toll. When the last document was signed, Awani gathered them up and held them against her chest. "It's done," she said simply. The faces at the windows began to fade, and the Cherokee symbols on the book pages slowly returned to normal English text. The oppressive atmosphere in the room lifted, replaced by something that felt almost like peace. But Crowder was not unchanged. The man who had signed those papers was not the same one who had entered the study that morning. His hair remained white, his face deeply lined, and his eyes held a haunted quality that Marcus suspected would never fully fade. "What happens now?" Marcus asked again. "Now you learn to live with the consequences of your choices," Awani replied. "Your father has taken the first step toward redemption, but it's only the beginning. The real work, the work of building a just society, that's up to all of you." She moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at them one final time. "The spirits are satisfied for now, but they're always watching, always waiting. Remember that." And as she left the study, Marcus helped his father to a chair. Crowder sat in silence for a long moment, staring at his hands as if he'd never seen them before. "Pa," Marcus said softly, "are you all right?" Crowder looked up at his son, and for the first time in years, Marcus saw something other than hardness in his father's eyes. There was pain there, and regret, and perhaps the beginning of wisdom. "No," Crowder said quietly, "I don't think I'll ever be all right again. But maybe that's how it should be." Outside, the sun was rising over Crowder's Rest, but it was no longer the same plantation it had been the day before. The papers Awani carried would change everything: the lives of the enslaved workers, the ownership of the land, the very nature of the community that had grown up around the plantation. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible on the morning breeze, the sound of Cherokee voices could be heard singing songs of justice and renewal, carried on the wind like a promise that the spirits would always remember, and they would always be watching. The reckoning was complete, but the real work was just beginning. 3 days after the signing of the papers, Crowder's Rest had transformed into something unrecognizable. Word of the freed, enslaved people had spread like wildfire through the county, bringing visitors from neighboring plantations, government officials, and curious townspeople who couldn't believe what they were hearing. Some came to congratulate Crowder on his sudden attack of conscience, while others arrived with barely concealed fury at what they saw as a betrayal of the established order. Sheriff Patterson was among the latter group. "Elias, what in God's name have you done?" Patterson demanded as he stormed into the main house, his boots tracking mud across the polished floors that Awani had cleaned just days before. "Half the county thinks you've lost your mind, and the other half wants to see you hanged for inciting rebellion." Crowder sat in his study, looking far older than his 50 years. The transformation that had begun during his encounter with Awani seemed to be continuing. His once powerful frame had become gaunt and stooped, and his eyes held a distant quality that made Patterson uncomfortable. "I did what needed to be done," Crowder said quietly, not looking up from the book he was reading. It was a volume of Cherokee history that had appeared on his desk the morning after the signing, though no one could explain how it had gotten there. "Needed to be done. You've given away a fortune, land, property, people, all of it gone with the stroke of a pen. Your neighbors are terrified that their own workers will get ideas, start demanding freedom papers of their own." "Maybe they should be terrified," Crowder replied, finally meeting Patterson's gaze. "Maybe we all should be. Do you know what we've built here, Sheriff? Do you understand the foundation this whole society rests on?" Patterson shifted uncomfortably. There was something in Crowder's voice that he'd never heard before, a kind of moral certainty that was deeply unsettling coming from a man who had never shown much interest in morality before. "I understand that you've lost your mind," Patterson said bluntly, "and I understand that if this spreads, we'll have chaos on our hands, slaves running wild, property values collapsing, the whole economic system falling apart." "Good," Crowder said simply, "let it fall apart. It was built on blood and suffering, and it deserves to crumble." Before Patterson could respond, Marcus appeared in the doorway. The young man looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept in days. "Sheriff, there's something you need to see." They followed Marcus outside, where a crowd had gathered near the slave quarters, but these weren't the same ramshackle cabins that had housed Crowder's workers for decades. Overnight, they had been transformed into something else entirely: neat, well-built homes with gardens and small workshops attached. The people who emerged from these dwellings moved with a dignity and purpose that Patterson had never seen in enslaved workers before. "How is this possible?" Patterson whispered. "These buildings..." They're completely different. She did it, Marcus said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and fear. Awani. Somehow she changed everything. Not just the buildings, but the people too. Look at them. Patterson looked, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The formerly enslaved workers were organizing themselves with an efficiency that spoke of long-suppressed intelligence and capability. They were dividing the land into family plots, establishing workshops for various trades, and setting up what appeared to be a school in one of the larger buildings. But it was their eyes that truly disturbed him. Gone was the careful subservience he was accustomed to seeing. Instead, these people looked at him with the calm confidence of equals, or perhaps even superiors who were choosing to tolerate his presence. "Where is she?" Patterson demanded. "Where's this Cherokee woman who's caused all this trouble?" Marcus and his father exchanged glances. "We don't know," Marcus admitted. "She was here yesterday morning, helping to organize the transition, but when we woke up today, she was gone." Gone where?" "Just gone. Her cabin is empty, but it's like she was never there at all. No personal belongings, no sign that anyone ever lived in that space." Patterson strode toward the cabin Marcus indicated, pushing through the crowd of newly freed people who watched his approach with expressions of polite indifference. The small building was indeed empty, but more than that, it was pristine, as if it had been scrubbed clean by an otherworldly force. But as Patterson examined the space more closely, he noticed something that made his skin crawl. Carved into the wooden walls, barely visible unless you knew where to look, were Cherokee symbols. They seemed to pulse with a faint inner light, and when he stared at them too long, he could swear he heard whispers in a language he didn't understand. "She's still here," he said quietly, backing out of the cabin. "Maybe not physically, but her influence. It's everywhere." And as if summoned by his words, a wind began to blow through the plantation grounds. It carried with it the scent of sage and wildflowers, and something else, something that reminded Patterson of ancient forests and sacred places that white men were never meant to see. The newly freed people seemed to feel it too. They stopped their work and turned their faces toward the wind, their expressions becoming peaceful and reverent. Some of them began to speak in Cherokee, though Patterson was certain that none of them had known the language the day before. "This is unnatural," Patterson muttered, his hand moving instinctively to the pistol at his side. "This whole situation is wrong. People don't just change overnight like this, don't they?" The voice came from behind him, and Patterson spun around to find himself face to face with old Moses, the former stable hand. But Moses looked different now, younger somehow, despite his advanced age, and his eyes held a wisdom that seemed to span generations. "Moses, what's happened to you?" "I remembered," Moses said simply. "We all remembered. Who we were before this place tried to break us, what we're capable of when we're not crushed under the weight of other people's cruelty." "This is some kind of Cherokee magic," Patterson accused. "That woman, she's done something to all of you." Moses smiled, and there was something in that expression that made Patterson take a step backward. "Magic? Maybe. Or maybe she just reminded us that we're human beings, not property, that we have the right to dignity, to freedom, to the pursuit of our own happiness." The wind was growing stronger now, and with it came sounds that shouldn't have been possible. The voices of Cherokee ancestors singing songs of liberation, the whispers of enslaved people who had died dreaming of freedom, the collective sigh of a land finally being allowed to heal from centuries of abuse. Patterson looked around wildly, trying to find some explanation for what he was experiencing. But everywhere he looked, he saw the same thing. People who had been broken by the system he helped to maintain, now standing tall and proud and utterly transformed. "Where is she?" he demanded again, his voice cracking with desperation. "Where's the Cherokee woman?" "She's everywhere," Moses replied. "In the wind, in the earth, in the hearts of everyone who's ever dreamed of justice. You can't arrest the wind, Sheriff. You can't put chains on a dream." As if to emphasize his point, the wind suddenly intensified, swirling around Patterson with enough force to knock him off balance. In that whirlwind, he caught glimpses of something that made his rational mind rebel. The figure of a Cherokee woman in traditional dress, her long hair flowing like dark water, her eyes burning with the fire of righteous anger. But when the wind died down, she was gone, leaving only the scent of sage and the echo of ancient songs. Patterson stumbled back toward his horse, his mind reeling from what he'd witnessed. As he mounted up, he caught sight of Crowder standing on the porch of the main house, watching the scene with an expression of profound sadness and acceptance. "This isn't over," Patterson called out. "The state won't stand for this. There'll be consequences." Crowder nodded slowly. "I'm sure there will be, but some things are worth facing consequences for. Some debts have to be paid, no matter the cost." As Patterson rode away from Crowder's Rest, he could hear the sound of Cherokee voices carried on the wind behind him. They were singing songs of victory and renewal, songs that spoke of justice finally being served and balance finally being restored. But he also heard something else in those voices. A warning, a reminder that the spirits were always watching, always waiting, and that the reckoning that had come to Crowder's Rest was just the beginning. The Cherokee woman might have vanished, but her legacy would endure in the hearts of the freed people, in the transformed landscape of the plantation, and in the growing understanding that the old ways of cruelty and oppression could not stand forever. Change was coming to Alabama, carried on the wind like the whisper of ancient voices demanding justice, and no amount of fear or resistance would be able to stop it. The spirits had spoken, and their word was law. 6 months had passed since Awani's disappearance, and the story of what happened at Crowder's Rest had spread far beyond the borders of Alabama. Newspapers from as far away as Boston and Charleston carried accounts of the miraculous transformation that had taken place on the plantation, though most reporters struggled to explain the supernatural elements that witnesses insisted were central to the story. The newly freed community had thrived beyond anyone's expectations. Under the leadership of Moses and Sarah, the former cook, who had revealed herself to be remarkably skilled in organization and planning, they had established a self-sufficient settlement that served as a beacon of hope for enslaved people throughout the South. They called it New Echota, after the former Cherokee capital, and visitors came from hundreds of miles away to see what freedom looked like when it was truly embraced. But it was the children who truly embodied the transformation that had taken place. Thomas Crowder, now 9 years old, spent most of his time in the settlement school that Sarah had established. He was learning to read and write alongside the children of the formerly enslaved families, and his natural kindness had made him popular among his new classmates. More remarkably, he was also learning Cherokee from an elderly woman named Ayanna, who claimed to be Awani's grandmother, though no one could explain how she had arrived at the settlement, or why she appeared to be no older than 50 despite claiming to be over 90. Marcus, on the other hand, had struggled with the changes. At 18, he was old enough to understand what his family had lost in material terms, but young enough to potentially embrace a different way of living. He spent his days torn between resentment at his reduced circumstances and a growing awareness that those circumstances had been built on the suffering of others. It was on a warm evening in late spring that Marcus finally encountered the truth he had been avoiding. He was walking through the settlement, observing the evening routines of the families who now called New Echota home, when he noticed a familiar figure sitting by the communal fire. It was Awani, looking exactly as she had the day she disappeared, wearing the same white Cherokee dress that seemed to glow in the firelight. "You're not real," Marcus said, approaching cautiously. "You vanished months ago. People saw you go." Awani looked up at him with those same dark eyes that had haunted his dreams. "What is real, Marcus? The suffering your family caused, the freedom these people have found, The spirits that watch over this place, I don't know anymore. Marcus sat down across from her, noting that none of the other people around the fire seemed to see her. Everything's changed. My father barely speaks. Thomas acts like he's forgotten he was ever a plantation owner's son, and I don't know who I'm supposed to be anymore. You're supposed to be whoever you choose to be, Awani replied. That's the gift of freedom, the ability to decide your own path rather than having it decided for you by circumstances of birth or the cruelty of others. Marcus stared into the fire, watching the flames dance and shift. But what if I choose wrong? What if I'm too much like my father to ever be anything better? Your father chose to change, even when it cost him everything he thought he valued. That choice is available to you as well, if you're brave enough to make it. And if I'm not, if I can't let go of the anger and resentment, Awani's expression grew sad. Then you'll become exactly what you fear, a man consumed by bitterness, unable to see the beauty and possibility that surrounds him. The spirits don't force change, Marcus. They only provide opportunities for it. Around them, the evening activities of the settlement continued. Children played games that blended Cherokee traditions with African customs and European influences, creating something entirely new. Adults shared stories and songs from their various cultures, weaving together a rich tapestry of human experience that transcended the artificial boundaries that had once divided them. How is this possible? Marcus asked. How did you do all this? I didn't do anything, Awani replied. I simply reminded people of what they already knew, that they were human beings, deserving of dignity and respect. The transformation you see here came from within them. It was always there, waiting for the chance to emerge. But the supernatural things, the spirits, the way buildings changed overnight, the voices in the wind, Awani smiled. The world is full of mysteries, Marcus. Your people have spent so much time trying to control and categorize everything that you've forgotten how to see the magic that exists all around you. My people never forgot. We know that the spirits of our ancestors are always with us, guiding and protecting us when we need them most. As if summoned by her words, the air around the fire began to shimmer. Marcus could see translucent figures moving among the living people of the settlement, Cherokee ancestors in traditional dress, African spirits with faces marked by tribal scarification, and even some European ghosts who seemed to be watching the proceedings with approval. They're all here, Awani explained, all the spirits of those who dreamed of justice and freedom. They've been waiting for a place like this, where their dreams could finally become reality. Marcus felt tears running down his cheeks, though he couldn't say exactly why he was crying. What happens now? What happens to places like this when the government decides it won't tolerate them anymore? Then we'll face whatever comes, together. But Marcus, you have to understand, this isn't just about one settlement in Alabama. This is about an idea, a way of living that recognizes the fundamental humanity of all people. Ideas like that can't be destroyed by governments or armies. They spread like seeds on the wind, taking root wherever they find fertile ground. The fire was beginning to die down, and the spirits around it were becoming harder to see. Awani herself seemed to be fading, becoming more translucent with each passing moment. Are you leaving again? Marcus asked. I was never really here, Awani replied. Not in the way you mean. But the part of me that matters, the part that believes in justice and freedom and the possibility of redemption, that will always be here as long as there are people willing to carry those beliefs forward. Will I see you again? You'll see me every time you choose kindness over cruelty, every time you stand up for someone who can't stand up for themselves, every time you remember that all people are connected by bonds deeper than race or class or nationality. Awani's voice was growing fainter, like an echo from a great distance. The spirits are always with us, Marcus. We just have to learn how to listen. As the last of the fire's light faded, Awani disappeared completely, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and the gentle sounds of the settlement preparing for sleep. But he didn't feel alone. For the first time since the transformation began, he felt connected to something larger than himself, a community, a purpose, a hope for a better future. The next morning, Marcus sought out Moses and asked to join the settlement's council. He wanted to help build something better than what his family had created, something that honored the dignity of all people, regardless of their background or circumstances. Moses studied the young man's face for a long moment before nodding. "Welcome, brother," he said simply. "There's much work to be done." And there was. In the months and years that followed, New Echota would face challenges from hostile neighbors, government interference, and the simple difficulties of building a new kind of society from scratch. But they would face these challenges together, guided by the principles that Awani had helped them remember and the spirits of their ancestors who watched over them. The story of the Cherokee woman who had vanished into legend would be told and retold, growing in the telling until it became something larger than history, a myth, a symbol, a reminder that justice might be delayed but could never be permanently denied. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind carried the scent of sage and wildflowers, the people of New Echota would swear they could hear her voice in the rustling of leaves, reminding them that the spirits were always watching, always waiting, always ready to help those who fought for what was right. The legacy lived on, carried forward by every person who chose hope over despair, justice over convenience, and love over fear. It was a legacy written not in books or monuments, but in the hearts and actions of ordinary people who had learned to see the extraordinary in themselves and each other. And in the end, that was the most powerful magic of all. 25 years had passed since the night Awani first appeared by the Tallapoosa River, and the world had changed in ways that few could have imagined. The Civil War had come and gone, leaving the South transformed and the institution of slavery officially abolished. But for those who remembered the events at Crowder's Rest, the war had seemed almost inevitable, a reckoning that had been building for decades, finally unleashed by forces that could no longer be contained. New Echota had not only survived but flourished, becoming a model for reconstruction communities throughout the South. The settlement now housed over 300 people of diverse backgrounds, former enslaved people, Cherokee who had returned from the Indian Territory, white families who had embraced the community's principles of equality and mutual aid, and even a few former Confederate soldiers who had found redemption in honest labor and genuine fellowship. Marcus Crowder, now 43, and bearing the weathered face of a man who had worked hard for everything he possessed, stood at the edge of the settlement cemetery as the sun set over the Alabama countryside. He was no longer the angry, confused young man who had struggled with his family's transformation. Time and experience had shaped him into something his father could never have imagined, a leader who governed through consensus rather than force, a man who measured success not in acres owned, but in lives improved. Beside him stood Thomas, now 34, and serving as the settlement's primary teacher. The younger Crowder brother had grown into a gentle, thoughtful man whose classroom innovations had attracted attention from educators as far away as Massachusetts. He had never married, dedicating his life instead to the children of New Echota, ensuring that each new generation understood both the history that had shaped their community and the principles that would guide its future. "Do you think she knows?" Thomas asked quietly, his gaze fixed on a simple stone marker that bore only the name Awani and a date, not of birth or death, but of the day she had first appeared at their plantation. "Do you think she knows what became of this place?" Marcus smiled, feeling the familiar presence that had watched over the settlement for all these years. "She knows. She's always known. The question is whether we've lived up to what she saw in us." The cemetery was a peaceful place. shaded by ancient oaks that had somehow grown to full maturity in just 2 decades. The graves it contained told the story of the community, former enslaved people who had lived to see their grandchildren born free, Cherokee elders who had passed down traditional knowledge to a new generation, and white settlers who had learned to see beyond the color of their neighbor's skin. But it was the newest grave that had brought the brothers here today. Elias Crowder had died 3 days earlier at the age of 70, his body finally succumbing to the weight of years and the spiritual transformation that had begun that night in his study. His final words, spoken to Marcus as he lay dying, had been simple. "Tell her I understand now. Tell her I'm grateful." The funeral had been unlike anything the old Alabama would have recognized. Cherokee prayers had been spoken alongside Christian hymns, African spirituals had blended with European folk songs, and people of all colors had stood together to honor a man who had spent the last quarter-century of his life trying to atone for the cruelty of his earlier years. "He changed," Thomas said, as if reading his brother's thoughts. "In the end, he really changed." "We all did," Marcus replied. "That was her gift to us, the chance to become something better than what we were." As the last light faded from the sky, a familiar wind began to blow through the cemetery. It carried with it the scent of sage and wildflowers, and something else, the whispered voices of ancestors who had never stopped watching over their descendants. The brothers stood in comfortable silence, feeling the presence of all those who had come before, and all those who would come after. "Marcus." The voice was so soft that at first he thought it was just the wind. But when he turned, she was there. Awani, looking exactly as she had 25 years ago, her white dress glowing in the moonlight that had somehow appeared despite the cloudy sky. "You came," he said simply. "I never left," she replied. "I've been here all along, watching, waiting, making sure the seeds we planted took root and grew strong." Thomas bowed his head respectfully. "We tried to honor what you taught us. We tried to build something worthy of the sacrifice." Awani moved between the graves, her feet making no sound on the soft earth. Where she walked, wildflowers bloomed in her footsteps, Cherokee roses and Alabama azaleas, African marigolds and European lavender, all growing together in impossible harmony. "You did more than honor it," she said. "You made it real. You took the dream of justice and freedom and gave it form, gave it life. This place," she gestured toward the settlement beyond the cemetery, where lights were beginning to appear in windows as families gathered for their evening meals. "This place is what America could be, if enough people had the courage to make it so." "Will it last?" Marcus asked. "Will what we've built here survive the challenges that are coming?" Awani paused beside her own grave marker, running her fingers over the carved stone. "Nothing lasts forever in its original form. But ideas, principles, the memory of what's possible, those things are eternal. They pass from one generation to the next, adapting and evolving, but never truly dying." She turned to face the brothers, and in her eyes they could see not just their own reflection, but the faces of all those who had been touched by the transformation of Crowder's Rest. "Your children and their children will face different challenges than you have. The forms of injustice will change, the faces of oppression will wear new masks, but the fundamental choice will remain the same, whether to choose love over fear, justice over convenience, hope over despair." "And you'll be there to guide them?" Thomas asked. "We'll all be there," Awani replied, and suddenly the cemetery was filled with spirits. Cherokee ancestors in traditional dress, African spirits with faces marked by tribal scarification, European ghosts who had learned to see beyond the prejudices of their earthly lives, and newer spirits too, including one that Marcus recognized as his father, standing tall and proud, and finally at peace. "The watch is eternal," Awani continued. "Every act of kindness, every stand against injustice, every choice to see the humanity in others, These things echo through time, creating ripples that spread far beyond what we can imagine. You've been part of something larger than yourselves, something that began long before you were born and will continue long after you're gone. The wind was growing stronger now, and with it came the sound of voices. Thousands of them, singing songs of freedom and justice in dozens of languages. It was the sound of every person who had ever dreamed of a better world. Every spirit who had ever fought against oppression, every soul who had ever believed that change was possible. "Remember us," Awani said, as she began to fade back into the wind and moonlight. "Remember what we've shown you here, and when the time comes for you to join us in the Eternal Watch, make sure you've left the world a little better than you found it." As the spirits disappeared and the cemetery returned to its peaceful silence, the brothers stood together in the darkness, feeling the weight of responsibility and the lightness of hope in equal measure. They had been given a gift, the chance to witness something miraculous, to be part of a transformation that had touched not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of New Ekota settling in for the night, children's laughter, adults sharing stories on front porches, the gentle music of a community at peace with itself. It was the sound of the future, of possibilities realized and dreams made manifest. And somewhere in that gentle symphony, carried on the wind like a blessing, they could swear they heard the voice of a Cherokee woman singing ancient songs of justice and renewal, reminding them that the spirits were always watching, always waiting, always ready to help those who fought for what was right. The story of Awani and Crowder's Rest would be told and retold for generations to come, growing in the telling until it became legend, then myth, then something even more powerful. A reminder that no matter how dark the world might seem, there was always hope for redemption, always a chance for transformation, always the possibility that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they chose to listen to the better angels of their nature. And in the end, that was the most important truth of all, that the power to change the world had always been within them, waiting only for the courage to use it. The eternal watch continued, and the spirits smiled, knowing that their work would never truly be finished, but that it would always be carried forward by those who remembered that justice, like love, was stronger than death.